Please welcome Kevin Watkins, CEO of Save the Children UK.
Thank you. It's really a fantastic privilege to be here. There is so much bad and difficult stuff happening in the world around us today, but being here is one of those moments where you just leave full of hope for the future. So huge thank you to all of you and to all of the other speakers. There are some things that are just tough to put into words, and I've got one thing that is really tough to put into words, and so I'm going to show you a short clip just to kick off. If I'd said the word pneumonia and I hadn't shown you that clip, I think most of you would have been thinking about a disease that affects elderly people in rich countries like the United States. Maybe some of you would have parents or grandparents who have suffered from the disease. But the best kept secret in global public health is that disease, which was a major killer of children in this country 150 years ago, is today the single biggest killer of children in the world's poorest countries. This year, about 900,000 young lives will be lost to that disease. Almost all of them will be less than 2 years old. That's around 10 children in the time that I'll be speaking to you. There's a slogan here, there's a hashtag here, 2030 now. One of the 2030 commitments is that there will be no preventable deaths of children by 2030. On current trends, we'll still have 730,000 deaths from this disease in 2030. And the great tragedy of that number is that this is a battle we can win. We can prevent pneumonia through incredibly effective vaccines. We can treat pneumonia. That little girl in that picture that I showed you, whose name was Hakaroon from South Sudan, her pneumonia, if it had been diagnosed early enough, could have been treated with 50 cents worth of antibiotics, amoxicillin. And even the most severe cases can be treated with more complex antibiotics and with oxygen. And so the obvious question that you have to ask is, why are we failing? Why are we treating the single greatest child health emergency of the SDG era as though it's some sort of sideshow that we can just sleepwalk our way around? My own wake-up call on pneumonia happened about a year ago in a pediatric ward of a hospital in a place called Turkana in northern Kenya. There were 30 children in that ward, including this little boy whose name is Jackson. Jackson is 3 years old, and he survived. In the week that I visited that hospital, 3 children died. And when I asked the parents about the cases that had arrived in that hospital, and I spoke to the doctors, there are a whole bunch of recurrent themes. The parents had spotted some of the early symptoms, but many of them were too poor to take their children to the clinic. They were worried that they wouldn't be able to afford the fees, or the clinic was too far away. In some cases, they'd taken them to the clinic. The clinic had diagnosed pneumonia, but they didn't have any antibiotics in store. And when the cases got more severe and the parents had taken them to higher level health facilities where they thought there would be oxygen available, they arrived and there wasn't any oxygen. And even on that ward, in one of the biggest hospitals in that part of Kenya, there were just 2 oxygen cylinders for 30 children, all of whom needed treatment. And so the question, and that story is played out dozens and dozens of times every single day around the world. And so the question arises of why. Why do we let this happen? A disease that we can defeat is defeating us and defeating the commitment that we made to children under the Sustainable Development Goals. If I had 20 minutes to talk to you, I would probably find very diplomatic ways of saying what I'm about to say now. Ways that would probably go down quite well in the UN General Assembly in the meetings that are happening next week. Because I don't have 20 minutes, I'm going to give you three very basic reasons. The first reason that we're failing to act, or that governments are failing to act, is the vast majority of those children are poor. They live in urban slums and they live in rural areas. And the governments who are going to pitch up here next week are going to wax lyrical about the great things they're doing to leave no one behind. But they're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. They're not making that commitment to children in their health spending priorities, and that's why children like Jackson don't have access to a health clinic when they need it. Second reason, let's be honest, this is a disease which doesn't cross social boundaries. It affects the poor, but it doesn't get transmitted to the middle class and to elites. And it doesn't cross national borders as a disease like Ebola does. And that's created a third problem, which is the utter complacency of the international community, of aid donors who, unlike other diseases where we've seen this extraordinary progress, like malaria and TB and measles, have virtually ignored pneumonia and ignored the biggest killer of children and put the lives of children like Jackson and Hakeroon and so many others into peril. Now, none of this is reason for despair. As I said right at the beginning, this is a battle we can win, but we have to wake up. The first thing that needs to happen is that governments have to talk less and do more to reflect their commitment to reaching the most marginalized children in their societies. That's a challenge that all of us have a responsibility for, to hold governments to account. The second thing in Save the Children, we're calling for every country with a high burden of pneumonia disease to adopt what we're calling a pneumonia action plan, a plan that would guarantee that no child that needs oxygen goes without, a plan that would guarantee that a child who could be cured for 50 cents worth of antibiotics will have access to those antibiotics, a plan that will ensure that there are trained community health workers who can diagnose and treat pneumonia when they see it. The third thing we need, in some ways, is the most important. The colleague of mine working in that clinic in Turkana, her name is Jadida. And Jadida's own son had a very bad experience of pneumonia, and she's committed herself to working with children who are suffering from the disease. And I asked her how she felt as a person to be working with these children, because it's very traumatic to watch a child with pneumonia. I think all of you will have understood that, having watched that first clip that I showed you. And what Jadida said to me will stay with me for as long as I live. She said, when I'm with those children, I feel them looking at me. And what I feel their eyes saying to me is, fight for me, fight for my life. I'm calling on all of you to join us in Save the Children and other organizations who are fighting for the lives of those children. We need to turn that commitment that there will be no preventable death by 2030 into action, and we need to start it with a global campaign to combat pneumonia. Thank you very much.